Imagine you are a young man. You have been conscripted into the military, not by choice, but by law. You are serving your country, and then one day someone in a position of authority discovers something about you. Not that you have committed a crime, not that you have failed in your duties, but that you are gay. What happens next is not a discharge. It is not a reprimand. It is not even a court-martial, not yet. What happens is that you are referred to a military psychiatric unit. A doctor meets with you. He is calm, professional, authoritative. He tells you that you have a condition, that it can be treated, that with the right intervention you can be changed, made normal, made useful, made acceptable to the institution that currently owns your time, your body, and your future. And if you refuse, court-martial, prison, dishonorable discharge. Your family told why. So you sit down, you roll up your sleeve. And what follows, over days, weeks, sometimes months, is one of the most sustained campaigns of medically sanctioned cruelty ever carried out against a group of soldiers in the name of military readiness. This happened for nearly 2 decades, in a country the world was watching for all the wrong reasons. This is the Aversion Project, and it was hidden for a very long time. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. Last time, we sat with the story of David Reimer, a man whose identity was overwritten by science before he was old enough to speak, and who spent his entire life fighting to reclaim what had been taken from him. We talked about the sovereignty of the self, about what it costs when an institution decides it knows better than a person who they are. Today we stay in that same territory. But the institution is not a university hospital. It is a military. The country is South Africa. The era is apartheid. And the targets are not infants who cannot speak. They are soldiers who have been stripped of the right to. The years are 1971 to 1989. South Africa is under the apartheid regime, a system of institutionalized racial segregation and white minority rule that classified, separated, and controlled its population with bureaucratic thoroughness. The South African Defense Force was the military arm of that regime, and it operated, like all institutions under apartheid, with the assumption that it had total authority over the people within its reach. Military service was compulsory for white South African men. They were conscripted, uniformed, and placed inside a hierarchy that brooked no deviation from its norms, racial, political, or otherwise. One of those norms was heterosexuality. The military's position on homosexuality was simple and brutal. It was a disorder, a defect, a security risk, and a moral contamination that needed to be identified, contained, and if possible, eliminated. Not through dismissal alone, through treatment, through science, through the confident application of psychiatric and medical authority to the project of making gay soldiers straight. The man placed in charge of this project was a psychiatrist named Dr. Aubrey Levin, operating out of Ward 22 of the Voortrekkerhoogte Military Hospital near Pretoria. What he built there, over nearly 2 decades, was a program that survivors have described in terms that leave no room for clinical euphemism. They call it torture. Soldiers identified as gay, through informants, through their own disclosures, through the military's surveillance of its own personnel, were referred to Ward 22 for psychiatric assessment. Once there, they were given a choice that was not really a choice: participate in the conversion program or face court-martial and imprisonment. The conversion methods employed by Levin and his staff were drawn from the theoretical toolkit of aversion therapy, the idea that unwanted behaviors could be extinguished by pairing them with intensely unpleasant stimuli. In practice, this meant the following. Patients were shown images of men, images designed to provoke sexual arousal, while electrodes were attached to their arms or legs. When arousal was detected or assumed, electric shocks were administered. The shocks were not symbolic. They were painful. They were repeated. The sessions were designed to associate same-sex attraction with pain, humiliation, and fear, to condition the body and the mind to recoil from something they did not choose to feel. For some patients, the program extended beyond electric shock therapy. Chemical castration, the administration of hormones designed to suppress sexual drive, was used in certain cases. And in the most extreme instances documented by survivors and investigators, individuals were subjected to forced surgical sex reassignment, not because they identified as transgender, but because the military had decided that a gay man who could not be made straight might be more acceptable as a woman. Let that settle for a moment. Soldiers were subjected to irreversible surgery, not as medical treatment for a condition they had, but as a solution to a characteristic the military found inconvenient. Estimates from investigators and survivor testimonies suggest that up to 900 individuals may have passed through the Aversion project over its nearly two-decade operation. The precise number is unknown because the records, like so much of what happened inside the apartheid security apparatus, were systematically destroyed before they could be examined. The survivors of the Aversion project did not speak publicly for many years. Apartheid did not end until 1994, and even after the transition to democracy, the stigma, the trauma, and the fear of not being believed kept most of them silent. Many had been told explicitly that if they spoke about what had happened to them, they would face consequences, that no one would believe them, that the word of a soldier against the word of a doctor in a military court in an apartheid state was not a contest worth entering. When survivors did begin to come forward, largely through the work of South African journalist and researcher Mickey Van Zyl and her colleagues in the late 1990s, what emerged was a picture of systematic, prolonged abuse carried out with institutional sanction and bureaucratic efficiency. Survivors described lasting psychological damage, depression, post-traumatic stress, an inability to form intimate relationships, a deep and persistent sense of shame that had been deliberately installed in them by people who called themselves healers. Some describe the electric shock sessions in terms that are difficult to read and more difficult still to hear. Not because the words are graphic, but because the calm, clinical precision with which they describe what was done to them is its own kind of horror. Dr. Aubrey Levin left South Africa after the end of apartheid and eventually settled in Canada, where he obtained a position as a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Calgary. For years, he practiced medicine in Canada with no public accountability for what had happened in Ward 22. In 2010, a patient at a Calgary clinic secretly filmed Levin sexually assaulting him during a consultation. The video was reported to police. An investigation followed. In 2013, Levin was convicted of 9 counts of sexual assault against patients in Canada and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was never formally prosecuted for the crimes committed in Ward 22. The destruction of records, the passage of time, the jurisdictional complexities of post-apartheid accountability, all of it combined to ensure that the soldiers he tortured in the name of military psychiatry never received the formal reckoning they deserved. South Africa's post-apartheid constitution became, in 1996, the first in the world to explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The country that had run the Aversion project became the country that enshrined the rights it had violated into its foundational law. That is not irony. It is the shape that history sometimes takes when the people who survived its worst chapters refuse to let it be forgotten. The Aversion project sits at the intersection of several of the darkest themes in this entire series. It is a story about institutional authority, about what happens when a government, a military, and a medical establishment align behind a single false premise and are given total power over the people who fall within their reach. It is a story about coercion disguised as treatment, about the use of the language and tools of medicine to carry out what is, in any honest accounting, a campaign of systematic harm. And it is a story about identity, about what it costs to be told, with the full force of the state behind the telling, that who you are is wrong, that it needs to be fixed, that your inner life is a defect requiring correction. The soldiers who went through Ward 22 were not broken by what was done to them in the sense that they ceased to exist. They survived. They carried on. But many of them carried the damage of those sessions into every relationship, every quiet moment, every encounter with intimacy for the rest of their lives. The aversion therapy did not make them straight. It made them afraid. And fear, installed at that depth by that kind of authority, is not easily unlearned. What the Aversion project teaches us, in the most unambiguous terms available, is that identity cannot be corrected. It can be suppressed, punished, and driven underground. But it cannot be removed. Every attempt in the history of science and medicine to eliminate homosexuality through aversion, chemistry, or surgery has failed. Not because the attempts were not thorough enough, but because there was never anything there to eliminate, only something to harm. The Aversion project operated for nearly 2 decades in a country the world condemned for its treatment of human beings. And yet, within that same condemned country, A program specifically targeting gay and lesbian soldiers was funded, staffed, and defended by the psychiatric establishment without meaningful challenge until it was too late for most of its victims. The survivors who came forward did something that required extraordinary courage. They named what had been done to them in plain language and refused to allow it to remain in the silence where it had been buried. Their testimony is part of the historical record now, and it belongs there. Next time, we close Chapter 5 with one of the most quietly devastating studies in this entire series. One that didn't involve electric shocks or surgery, but a simple, terrible decision made at the moment of birth. Twins separated deliberately and in secret, raised in different families. Never told why their lives felt somehow incomplete. That is the separated twin study, and it is waiting for you in the next video. Subscribe so you're here for it. Leave a comment below. The Aversion Project is a story that deserves to be heard. Tell me what it brought up for you. I'll see you in the next one.